You're going to have sex with me." The words hit him like a physical blow, spoken by the virgin woman he'd just discovered in his abandoned barn. Fletcher Knox thought his uncle had left him nothing but debts, a sagging ranch, and the heavy silence of a place abandoned for far too long. He was wrong. When he pushed open the great barn door, the rusted hinges screaming in protest, he found a secret still breathing in the dust-choked air. A woman stood barefoot in the straw, her dress in tatters, her long dark hair matted with dirt and dried blood. She gripped a rusted knife in her hand, not like a shield, but like a sentence already written. Her eyes, wide and fierce, never wavered as she spoke the words that froze him right where he stood. "You're going to have sex with me." It wasn't a proposition, it was desperation, carved into a demand. It wasn't about desire, it was about survival. Would you have stayed, or would you have run for the hills? Let me know in the comments where you're listening from. And make sure you hit that subscribe button, because you are not going to want to miss what happens next in this unforgettable frontier tale. Fletcher Knox had expected the barn to be as lifeless as the rest of the property his uncle Marcus had left behind. Just another hollow shell filled with memories and decay. Dust hung in the air like old ghosts, dancing in the slivers of afternoon light that pierced the decaying roof. The scent of mildew and neglect, thick and cloying, curled into his nose. He had inherited a pile of debts, spoiled accounts with the general store, and a ranch whose fences sagged like the spines of tired old men. He was prepared for silence. He was prepared for emptiness. What he wasn't prepared for was the faint scrape of movement from inside the barn, the sound of something living where nothing should have been. He'd pushed the door open slowly, the light knifing through the gloom, illuminating straw scattered in uneven piles, the rusted hulks of forgotten farm equipment, and the definite, unmistakable outline of a figure standing right in the middle of it all. She was barefoot. Her dress, a ragged thing that might once have been a crisp white, now bore the stains of dirt and something darker, something reddish-brown and dried. Her hair, long and black, clung in tangled snarls against her face and shoulders. In her hand, she held a kitchen knife, rusted along the edge, and she gripped it not with panic, but with a grim, chilling steadiness that sent a wave of ice through his veins. Her eyes found his across the dusty expanse. They were steady, unblinking. And then she spoke, her voice as calm, as matter-of-fact, as if she were asking him to pass the salted supper. "You're going to have sex with me." Fletcher froze solid where he stood. The heavy saddlebag he'd been carrying slipped from his shoulder, hitting the dirt floor with a soft thud that echoed like a gunshot in the cavernous space. The woman didn't flinch. She didn't even blink. She stood as though she were carved into the very air of the barn, a statue of desperation, just waiting for his answer. He could see her hand, the one holding the knife, trembled slightly, but her voice had not. It wasn't an invitation. It wasn't even a demand, not really. It was a sentence that had already been carried out in her mind, an arrangement she had decided upon long, long before he ever arrived. Fletcher felt his throat tighten, his mouth suddenly bone dry. His eyes darted past her, scanning the shadows at the far end of the barn. He saw a makeshift bed, fashioned out of old burlap sacks, laid out in a careful, deliberate nest. Next to it, empty tin cans were stacked in neat rows, each one cleaned, each one placed with precision. And on the wooden wall behind them, scratched deep into the grain, were tally marks. Hundreds of them. Days, weeks, maybe months. This barn had not been abandoned, not at all. Someone had been living here. Someone had been waiting. And now that someone stood before him with a knife in her hand, speaking like a woman who had already decided exactly what she was willing to sacrifice. Fletcher's first instinct, the primal urge screaming in his skull, was to back away, to step out into the fading sunlight and ride until this barn and everything inside it became nothing more than a bad, half-forgotten memory. But something in her tone, the sheer weight of it, kept him rooted to the dirt floor. The words she had spoken weren't laced with hunger or seduction. They carried the heavy, undeniable weight of a bargain forged in the fires of pure desperation. Her bare feet shifted slightly on the packed earth, her toes curling against the cold, but the knife remained steady, pointed at the space between them. "I think there's been some mistake," Fletcher said, his voice low and careful, the way he might try to soothe a spooked horse. "I don't know who you are, but I'm not—" "There's no mistake," she cut in, her words sharp enough to silence him completely. "You're here, and that means they'll be here soon. And when they come, they'll want to know why I'm still breathing." The tremor in her hand gave away her fear, but the eyes that were fixed on him were carved from something harder than simple panic. It was the look of a woman who had already played out every single possibility in her mind, and found this one, this outrageous, unthinkable demand, to be the only path that left her alive at the end of the day. Fletcher swallowed hard, the taste of dust thick in his mouth. He dared another glance over her shoulder, his eyes adjusting to the dim light. Beyond her makeshift bedding, the barn bore other marks of habitation. That rag of cloth draped across a beam, as if it had been used for washing. A broken lantern with a wick still blackened from recent use. And on the far wall, the tally marks seemed endless, a testament to time spent in hiding, scratched deep and desperate into the wood. "Who's coming?" Fletcher asked finally, the words catching rough in his throat. For the first time since he'd stepped inside, something flickered across her face. A hint of uncertainty. She shifted just slightly, as though the weight of the knife in her hand had suddenly grown heavy. "You really don't know, do you?" Her voice dropped, and though she tried to hide it, he heard the frayed edge of utter exhaustion woven into her tone. She took a step closer, her bare feet silent on the warped floorboards, and Fletcher felt the air between them tighten, charged with a tension he couldn't begin to understand. "They'll smell your presence on this place," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "They'll see your horse. And when they do, you'll either have an answer for why I'm still alive, or they'll bury us both right here in this barn." And that's when Fletcher realized this was no madness. This was a cold, hard calculation. A script she had rehearsed in her mind 1,000 times over, long before his arrival. She had been waiting. And somehow, impossibly, she had been waiting for him. Fletcher edged a step to the side, careful not to draw any closer to the rusted blade in her hand. The barn was dim, but his eyes were adjusting, and what he was seeing now set his nerves on fire. The straw had been pulled into a rough nest near the corner, flattened by the weight of someone sleeping there for far, far too long. The blanket of burlap sacks was arranged with the precision of a soldier folding his kit, and beside it stood that small, strange tower of empty tins, each one rinsed clean, each one stacked like bricks in a wall against the encroaching chaos. It wasn't the frantic scattering of a vagrant who had stumbled in out of the cold. It was order. It was a life being endured here, a life measured carefully in small, desperate rituals of survival. Fletcher's gaze climbed higher, toward the great wooden beams that braced the barn's roof. His chest tightened when he saw the marks. Long, ragged lines etched deep into the wood, grouped in fives with a slash through each group. The oldest ones were faded and darkened with dust, but the newest were still sharp, still showing curling slivers of pale timber where the knife had bitten deep. Days, weeks, maybe even years. Whoever she was, she had been counting the slow, agonizing passage of time. Her prison was measured by scratches on a wall that no one was ever meant to notice. "You've been here a long while," Fletcher murmured, the words spoken more to himself than to her. The woman's eyes flicked toward the marks, then snapped back to him, cold and unyielding. She didn't answer. She didn't need to. The evidence of her long captivity was carved into the very walls of his barn. He felt the hairs rise along the back of his neck. The ranch had been abandoned for 2 years, maybe more, ever since his uncle Marcus Knox's death. Everyone in the nearby towns swore that no one ever came out here. It was a place left to rot. Yet here she stood, barefoot and somehow unbroken, her knife steady, her voice rehearsed. Fletcher dared to test her silence again. "Why wait for me?" For the very first time, her lips curved into something that resembled a smile. But there was no warmth in it. There was only a cold, hard knowledge that terrified him. "Because you're Fletcher Knox." The sound of his own name on her tongue chilled him more than the knife ever could. She hadn't been waiting for just any stranger. She hadn't been waiting for rescue. She had been waiting specifically, deliberately, for him. And that meant his uncle's legacy carried far more than just debts and rotting fences. It carried secrets. Secrets that had been watching him, waiting for him, long before he ever set foot inside this barn. The moment hung between them, thick and heavy, his name still clinging to the dusty air. And then another sound bled into the barn. It was distant at first, a low rhythm like thunder buried deep under the earth. Then it grew sharper, closer, the unmistakable sound of hooves striking hardpan in unison, closing in and closing in fast. Fletcher's blood ran cold. He knew the cadence of mounted men. He knew the sound of inevitable pursuit. But here, in this forgotten, isolated place, it felt like the ground itself was rising up to deliver judgment. The woman's head snapped toward the open door, her body instantly rigid. The knife in her hand trembled once, then steadied, as if the sound had confirmed something she'd been dreading for a very long time. "They're here," she whispered, her voice a ghost of a sound. "They always come." Fletcher moved instinctively toward the doorway, his thoughts racing to his horse, tethered in the yard, but her voice cut him short, low and sharp as a whip crack. "Don't. If they see you, we both die." She crossed the barn in 3 swift, silent steps and pressed her free hand against a section of wall that he had thought was solid. With a practiced push, the boards gave way, swinging inward to reveal a narrow, dark hollow between the inner and outer planks of the barn wall. Inside. Now. He hesitated for only a second before the sharp, metallic sound of spurs carried across the yard. Men were dismounting. He heard the creak of saddle leather, the low and guttural sound of voices speaking in accents he couldn't quite place. Tabitha shoved him into the crawl space first, then slipped in right after him, pulling the hidden panel closed until they were both swallowed in absolute darkness. The rough wood pressed tight against his back. The stale air filled his lungs with the scent of old straw and sweat and fear. Through the narrow gaps between the boards, Fletcher caught fragmented glimpses of the barn. Heavy boots tracked across the dirt floor. Rifles glinted in the dying light slanting through the door. A voice, older, roughened by smoke and command, called out, "Search everywhere. She's been here. The ashes in the lantern are still warm." Another voice answered, this one younger, almost eager. "Yes, boss." Fletcher's heart was thudding so loud against his ribs that he was certain they'd be able to hear it through the wall. And then a name carried across the space, spoken with a cold certainty, like an accusation. Catherine Cross. In the suffocating darkness, he felt the woman beside him stiffen, her entire body going rigid. Her grip tightened on the handle of her knife until her knuckles pressed cold and hard against his arm. Her breath brushed his ear as she leaned close enough to whisper, her words a desperate plea. "Don't move, don't speak. Whatever they say, whatever they do, you have to remember. Catherine Cross is dead." The scrape of heavy boots against the floorboards drew closer, slow and deliberate, until Fletcher could see the dust rising in clouds through the narrow seams of the wall. A man stooped near the barn door, his fingers brushing across the worn leather of the saddlebag Fletcher had dropped just moments before. The voice that followed was sharp with a cruel satisfaction. "Fresh gear! Looks like someone new is here." Another man answered, the younger one, his tone almost giddy with excitement. "Well then, She ain't alone anymore, is she? Fletcher felt a cold, heavy weight settle in his chest. His carelessness, his one simple mistake of dropping that bag, had marked him as clearly as if he'd carved his own name into the dirt outside. He turned his head slightly, just enough to glimpse the woman's profile in the thin sliver of light. She wasn't trembling now. She was as rigid as stone. Every muscle in her body was locked tight, her knife pressed hard against her thigh. Then, one of the intruders lifted something from a shadowed corner of the barn. It was a battered leather satchel, its surface worn soft by years of use. A faded ribbon spilled from the opening, binding a bundle of letters, their pages yellowed with age and dust. The man thumbed through them by the light of a match, his foreign accent curling around each word as though he were savoring them. Catherine Cross, he read aloud, letting the name linger in the air like a curse. Beside Fletcher, the woman drew in a sharp breath that cut off halfway, her body gone as taut as a wire. Her face was hidden from him in the darkness, but the sharp, sudden silence of her reaction spoke louder than any confession ever could. The older voice, the one that carried the weight of command, chuckled low and deep. So, she's still using that name. The foolish girl. Then, his voice grew quieter, laced with an edge of respect that made Fletcher's stomach twist into a knot. Henrik Weiss will be pleased. Very pleased indeed. The name struck Fletcher harder than the butt of a rifle. He had heard it before, whispered in the back rooms of town saloons, always with a sense of unease. Weiss. The foreign trader who came and went like a shadow, his wealth swelling while other good men lost everything they had. Men spoke his name in hushed tones, never with trust, and often with a great deal of fear. The intruder tucked the bundle of letters carefully into the inner pocket of his coat. She'll return for these, he said with certainty. She has to, and when she does, we'll be waiting. Through the cracks in the wall, Fletcher saw their leader smile, a cruel, patient smile, before he turned toward the barn door. And in that moment, Fletcher understood with a chilling clarity that this ranch was no simple inheritance. His uncle's death, the deed in his pocket, the strange woman hiding beside him in the dark, all of it was tangled up in a net of secrets spun by men who killed without hesitation. And somehow, without any choice in the matter, he was already caught inside it. The sharp, acrid reek of coal oil reached them before Fletcher even saw it. Through the narrow gaps in the wall, he watched in horror as a dark sheen spread across the barn floor, poured careless and heavy from a dented tin can. The liquid soaked greedily into the dry straw and old wood, its fumes clawing up his nostrils until his eyes began to water. A single spark, just one, would turn this entire place into a roaring furnace. The men spoke very little now, their movements methodical and grim. The scrape of their boots and the hollow clang of the empty tin container were louder than any words could be. Beside him, the woman's hand tightened on his arm, her fingers digging into his flesh. He could feel the tremor in her grip, a frantic, desperate vibration, though her whisper was impossibly steady. "Run!" She pressed upward, her fingers working at a loose board in the wall above their heads. Dust cascaded down, a shower of grit stinging Fletcher's eyes. For one terrifying instant, he thought the sound would betray them, but the intruders were laughing now, their voices echoing as they joked about how quickly the old, dry barn would catch fire. The woman widened the gap with a practiced push, the move of someone who had tested this escape route before, many times. A sliver of pale daylight filtered through the opening. It was weak, but it was real. A single thread of salvation in the encroaching darkness. She gestured once with her head, sharp and urgent. Fletcher swallowed hard and hauled himself upward. The narrow space scraped his shoulders raw as he climbed, every creak of the old timber sounding like a gunshot in his ears. When he finally broke through the roof slats, the sudden, brilliant glare of the late afternoon sun blinded him. The wooden shingles were hot beneath his palms, their edges rough enough to tear skin. He dragged himself clear, his heart pounding in his chest, then reached back down as the woman emerged behind him, as swift and silent as a shadow. But their escape had not gone unnoticed. Voices rose from below. One of the men had caught the faint rasp of their movement. A shout carried up to them, then the sharp metallic clatter of a rifle being raised. The woman didn't hesitate. Not for a second. She sprinted across the steep pitch of the roof, as light and sure-footed as a cat, despite the incredible danger. Fletcher followed right behind her, the old shingles groaning and cracking under his heavier weight. At the far edge of the roof, she paused for only a fraction of a second, just long enough to point toward the large wooden water barrel at the corner of the barn. Then she vanished, flinging herself into the open air. Fletcher saw her strike the water with a splash that sent droplets glinting like diamonds in the sun. He leapt after her without a thought, hitting the water hard, the impact jarring his bones. They staggered out of the barrel together, drenched to the bone and gasping for air. A rifle cracked from the barn doorway, and splinters of wood sprayed from the wall right beside them. More shots followed, the reports echoing sharp and angry across the yard. Fletcher grabbed her hand, his fingers locking with hers, and pulled her toward the distant line of cottonwood trees. And behind them, the dogs began to bark, high-pitched and eager, the unmistakable sound of the hunt, already loosed upon them. The creek bit into Fletcher's skin like 1,000 tiny blades of ice. Each step sent painful shocks through his legs, and the strong current tugged hard at his heavy, waterlogged boots. But the rushing water was their only cover, their only hope of washing away their scent and confusing the dogs. Behind them, the baying of the hounds carried wild and clear through the cottonwoods, the handlers shouting commands over the echoing sounds of the pursuit. Fletcher forced his breathing to be slow and steady, though each gasp for air clouded white in the cold evening air. The woman, Tabitha, he had decided to call her in his mind, moved ahead of him with a surprising sureness of footing, her tattered skirts dragging heavy in the current. Her face was pale, her lips pressed into a thin, tight line with something that went far beyond fear. At last, she stopped beneath the deep shadow of an overhanging willow tree, the long, thin strands of her dark hair plastered like ink against her pale cheeks. She turned to face him, her eyes hollowed out by exhaustion, yet somehow still unflinching. "Your uncle didn't die in his bed," she said, her voice barely louder than the churn of the water around them. "Henrik Weiss killed him. He killed him slowly, and he made me watch every second of it." The world seemed to tilt on its axis for Fletcher. He shook his head, half expecting the current to carry her impossible words away before they could take root in his mind. "That's not possible," he managed to say, his own voice sounding distant and strange. "The doctor said it was a fever." "The doctor was paid," she cut in, her words sharp enough to silence any further protest. Her hand gripped his sleeve, her fingers digging in as she steadied herself against both the powerful stream and the crushing weight of the memory. Marcus found proof of weapons shipments bound for the tribes. They were being sold at both ends, so Weiss could bleed this entire frontier dry for his own profit. He was going to take it to the federal marshals. Her voice dropped to a whisper. That's what those letters were. The record. Dates, places, prices, and me. I was the witness. Her jaw trembled, but her eyes held fast to his, forcing him to see the truth in them. Marcus trusted me. He trusted that my words, my testimony, would matter. And for that, Weiss broke him. Every hour was stretched out, drawn out, so that I would know the true cost of honesty. She glanced down, the black water swirling around her waist, then whispered, the words filled with a pain so deep it was almost a physical thing. Marcus died protecting me. I ran while he was screaming at me to go. Fletcher's throat tightened until he could barely breathe. A memory of his uncle rose up in his mind like a ghost. Marcus Knox, the man who always returned pennies from overcharges at the store, the man who once rode 20 miles through a blizzard just to keep a simple promise to a neighbor. To imagine that man, his uncle, broken and tortured under the hand of Henrik Weiss, was almost too much for his mind to bear. He looked at the woman, at Tabitha, at the absolute ruin of her dress, at the marks of grief and endurance carved into her face, and he felt the truth of her words strike him deeper than the biting cold of the water. His uncle's death had never been a simple fever. It had been a murder, a deliberate, cold-blooded murder, bought and paid for. And the inheritance Fletcher carried in his pocket was not a deed to a piece of land. It was a debt of blood, and it was waiting to be paid in full. The current pulled relentlessly at them, as though trying to drag them both under and wash them away. But Tabitha pressed herself deeper into the shadow of the willow tree. Her voice dropped lower still, becoming a conspiratorial whisper, as though she feared that even the running water might carry her words back to the men who were hunting them. Weiss wasn't working alone, she said, her eyes darting nervously toward the direction of the barking dogs. He was just the hand holding the knife. There's more behind him, so much more. Money, names, powerful men from across the ocean. They've been feeding weapons into this land for years, stirring up trouble wherever it profits them the most. Her words painted a terrifying picture. Tribes against the settlers, settlers against the law against itself. They want this whole frontier to be on fire, Fletcher, so they can be the ones to sell the water to put it out. Fletcher stared at her, the creek swirling black and cold around their waists. The thought alone was like a poison seeping into his mind, but the absolute certainty in her eyes told him that this wasn't just speculation. It was knowledge, knowledge she had been forced to carry, alone, for far too long. He felt the familiar ache of long cattle drives in his bones, remembered the nights where men fought over a misplaced tally mark or a stolen steer. That was the small, petty chaos of survival. But this was something else entirely. This was chaos that had been crafted, sharpened, and deliberately unleashed. "They have the letters," he said flatly, his jaw tightening until his teeth ached. The proof that Marcus died trying to keep safe. Tabitha shook her head hard, sending droplets of water flying. "You don't understand. Going back for them would be walking into the gallows with your own rope already around your neck. Weiss's men expect us to run. They'll hunt us until we're cornered, and there's nowhere left to go." "But if we circle back," Fletcher cut in, his voice grim and steady, a new resolve hardening inside him. "Then we take them by surprise." He gripped the thick trunk of the willow tree, the rough bark digging into his palm, grounding him in the swirling water. "I've run herds through stampedes and through storms. I know what prey looks like when it's cornered, and I know that a wolf never looks for teeth behind him. They'll never, ever think we'd turn and come back for them." Tabitha's expression hardened, a flicker of disbelief shading into something that looked almost like grief. "That's suicide, Fletcher. They'll cut you down before you even set foot in their camp." He met her eyes, the words falling from his lips like chips of iron. "Then at least we die fighting instead of running." The river hissed and rushed around them, the cries of the hunting dogs echoing closer and closer through the trees. And in that moment, Tabitha saw that he wasn't bluffing. He wasn't speaking from desperation or a thirst for blind revenge. He was speaking from the grim, unshakable resolve of a man who had suddenly realized he had nothing left to lose and nothing left to fear but his own cowardice. The valley was cloaked in an inky darkness when Fletcher and Tabitha edged their way down the steep, rocky slope. Every step was deliberate, every loose stone a potential danger that could give them away. Below them, the ruins of the old way station glowed with the warm, flickering light of a campfire. Weiss had made his camp within the broken, crumbling walls. The fire threw long, dancing shadows that twitched and jerked across the collapsed beams like monstrous puppets. Horses stood tethered nearby, stamping the ground impatiently, their ears flicking at the scent of a danger that none of their masters seemed to notice. From their hiding place, Fletcher counted the silhouettes. 2 men were crouched by the fire, methodically cleaning their rifles. Another man was posted as a watchman at the far edge of the camp, his back turned toward the creek, his posture relaxed and easy. It was the pure arrogance of hunters who were absolutely certain that their prey had nowhere else to run. And at the center of it all, sitting on a flat rock, was Weiss himself. His silver hair caught the firelight, glowing like a halo. His scarred hands were shuffling through a spread of papers. He read as though he were savoring each and every word, lifting the pages closer to the flame to catch more of the glow, his mouth curving into a slight, amused smile. Marcus's letters. The evidence that was meant for the marshals, now being pawed through by the very man who had murdered his uncle. Fletcher felt a white-hot heat rise in his chest. An anger so sharp, so pure, it was almost impossible to contain. Tabitha's hand brushed against his arm, a feather-light touch that was enough to ground him. She pointed silently toward a scatter of large boulders on the far side of the encampment, her eyes telling him in no uncertain terms that she would be the one to draw their gaze. He nodded once, a single, sharp dip of his chin. Then she was gone, slipping away into the deep shadow, her movement no louder than a breath of wind. A heartbeat later, a single stone clattered down the hillside, the sound loud enough to crack the silence of the night. The watchman turned instantly, his rifle raised. The other 2 men by the fire followed his gaze, leaving Weiss momentarily alone. That was all the opening Fletcher needed. He broke cover, the distance between them swallowed in a silent, desperate rush. He dove across the flat rock where Weiss was sitting, scattering the precious letters into the dirt. Weiss looked up, startled at first. Then he grinned, as though he were amused by a child's foolish defiance. His hand dropped to the pistol holstered at his belt, his movements far too quick, far too fluid for a man his age. Marcus Knox was a meddling fool, he said, his voice a low, confident growl, as he leveled the barrel of the gun directly at Fletcher's chest, just like his nephew. The shot never came. A thunderclap of a gunshot rang out from the darkness, and Weiss jerked back as if he'd been struck by lightning, his coat suddenly blooming with a dark, wet red. Tabitha stood at the edge of the fire's light, her revolver smoking in her hand, her eyes fixed on the man she had feared for so very long. Weiss collapsed across the rock, his lifeblood soaking into the very papers he had just been mocking. They searched his body in a grim, heavy silence, and they found more than just the letters. They found maps, inked with secret routes and hidden caches. They found lists of names, names threaded with power and influence. And they found correspondence signed only with a title, the General, Klaus Ertor. A shadow larger and more dangerous than Weiss could ever be, and the absolute proof that the conspiracy they had stumbled into was far, far from over. The fire still smoldered in the ruins of the way station when Fletcher pressed the thick packet of letters to his chest. Their edges were still damp with the blood of Henrik Weiss. Tabitha stood beside him, her face pale in the dying firelight, but steady, watching the last of the sparks drift upward into the starless night sky. They did not speak until the horses were gathered and the camp was left far behind them. The words would come later, when the silence no longer felt like a necessary tool for survival. By morning, they reached the town's telegraph office. It was a weather-beaten shack with a single wire stretching eastward, a thin, fragile lifeline strung across the vast, empty plains. Fletcher spread the papers across the wooden counter, every map and coded letter, every single line of his Uncle Marcus's careful, meticulous record. And he told the weary operator just one name: Marshal Carson, Denver. The man's eyes widened at the weight of it all, at the sheer gravity of what was laid out before him, but he asked no questions. The insistent clicking of the telegraph machine began almost at once, a mechanical heartbeat carrying their heavy burden across the wire out into the world. 3 weeks later, the valley was no longer Weiss's domain. Federal marshals rode hard into the territory, grim-faced men with badges that answered to no local judge or crooked sheriff. Camps were seized, weapons caches were unearthed, and powerful names were dragged kicking and screaming into the harsh light of day. The vast, intricate network that Artur had spun through whispers and bribes began to unravel with a startling, satisfying speed. Once the evidence bled into every office that mattered, the game was over. Weiss lay cold in the ground, and Artur, hunted across borders, could no longer operate from the safety of the shadows. For Fletcher, the reckoning was a much quieter affair. The ranch, once hollow and heavy with neglect, began to breathe again. The sagging fences were mended, the well drawn clean. The old barn was scrubbed of its scars, though the memory of what had happened there lingered in every beam, a silent ghost. Tabitha moved easily through the small ranch house now, no longer barefoot on dirt floors, but steady and sure on her own ground. He watched her one afternoon as she was hanging laundry on a line strung between two tall cottonwood trees. The white cloth snapped and billowed in the warm breeze, like flags of surrender that had somehow, against all odds, turned into flags of victory. The sun caught her hair, no longer matted with dust and fear, but loose and dark and shining. Her face was lifted to the sky, and there was no trace of fear in it. She noticed his gaze on her, and she smiled. It was the first true, unguarded smile he had ever seen from her. Fletcher stepped forward, and her hand found his, her touch warm and certain. He thought of the rusted knife in the barn, of the first desperate words she had ever spoken to him, and he felt the immense weight of their journey finally settle into something solid, something real. "No regrets?" she said softly, her eyes testing him. He held her hand a little tighter, his voice quiet, but absolutely sure. None at all. If you enjoyed this story, click the video on your screen now to watch another unforgettable tale where courage and destiny collide in the untamed frontier. Don't forget to subscribe and consider leaving a super chat to help us keep bringing you more stories just like these. Your support means everything to us.